From just after the dawn of Soviet Russia in 1917 to the death of Stalin in 1953, more than 20 million prisoners flowed through the Soviet Gulag system, and by the end, nearly 2 million people had died. There were some 30,000 camps spread across the country, providing slave labor that ran the Soviet industrial machine. The Stalinist regime created a culture of hyper-paranoia, where one wrong look could get you sent to Siberia to cut timber or work in the mines. Inside the camps, things were bleak. From gang warfare to mass executions to killer cold and starvation, Russians who were considered threats to the Soviet Union were subjected to some of the most horrific conditions in history. Welcome back to Nutty History. Today, we're exploring why you wouldn't survive life in the Soviet gulags. Viewer discretion is advised for this video, as some of this video may be offensive or disturbing. We, the makers of this video, in no way support or condone the actions of the subjects featured. The Solovetsky and the Kolyma camps were some of the most brutal gulags around. Solovetsky is known for being one of the first. It was located on an archipelago in northwest Russia, near the border with Finland. Before the Soviets, it had been a monastery, but when the Red Army took control, they converted it into a gulag and imprisoned the monks within it. Religion was, after all, very anti-Soviet. The only worship allowed in Soviet Russia was the worship of the state. Solovetsky was a place where the Soviets worked out how best to exploit their prisoners. The Gulag system had just come into fruition when Solovetsky was opened in 1923, and they were still working out the kinks. As a result, there were many instances of sadistic and random punishment of the prisoners by the guards. Stories would emerge of guards leaving prisoners unclothed in the freezing Arctic winters with their hands and feet tied behind their backs. Some were forced to run bare to the baths, over 2 kilometers away. They were fed rotten meat and given pointless tasks like moving snow from one place to another. In the summer, prisoners would be tied to trees in the forest, which was swarming with mosquitoes, and get bit so much that they lost consciousness. Between 1923 and 1930, around half of the prisoners at Solovetsky died of starvation and diseases like typhus. Every year. There were always more prisoners to replace the dead, though. The Soviets' witch hunt was flourishing. Leftist, socialist, the religious, writers, critics, you name it. No one was safe. It wasn't just the guards you needed to be worried about in the gulags. Many of them had gangs. The Stalinist regime was pretty indiscriminate about who they locked up. Convicts mingled with intellectuals and scientists. Eventually, a gang system emerged in the gulags, with a hierarchy that resembled the Italian mafia. There were bosses called pack huns, and beneath them were their officers known as sheshtoyorka. They abided by a code called the Thieves' Law, which was similar to the prison codes followed in American prisons today. Gang members often had tattoos that identified their role within the gang, what they were in prison for, and even messages subverting communist propaganda. Initiation usually involves some act of physical violence, like assaulting someone who the pack huns had beef with inside the camp. The gangs controlled almost everything within many of the gulags. Other prisoners often feared the wrath of the gangs more than the wrath of the guards. If you did something the gangs didn't like, you'd be beaten, punctured, or even face an untimely death. Because food was scarce, stealing it was one of the ultimate crimes, punishable by death. The gangs even set up ad hoc courts where they would hold legal proceedings complete with witness testimony and senior figures acting as judges. By the 1940s, the Soviets had streamlined the Gulag system and created stricter guidelines for how their slave labor camps were operated. They became a key way for the Soviet Union to build its economy. Many of the camps were built around mines or forests where prisoners would be put to work cutting timber or extracting gold and coal. Kolyma is a region in eastern Siberia where a series of gulags were set up beginning in 1932. 20 years later, there were nearly 200,000 prisoners in the camps who were forced to mine gold and work on timber operations. But just getting to the gulags in Kolyma was deadly. The journey to the Kolyma camps became known as the Road of Bones. Kolyma was, and is, remote in the far northeast reaches of Siberia. Tens of thousands of prisoners died along the dangerous route through the Siberian wilderness. Prisoners who built the road in the first place, and then later, prisoners who were transported along it. Another way to get to the gulags was by crowded prison ships, where thousands more died in transport. If they survived, it was likely a one-way journey. The mortality rate at the Kolyma gulags was estimated at 80%, and if you tried to escape, you'd likely die from the cold, freezing weather and starvation. If you were in prison in a gulag between 1931 and 1937, there's a chance you would have ended up buried underneath a canal you dug with your own hands. At the beginning of the 1930s, Stalin was hungry for a massive, glorious Soviet infrastructure project. The first was the White Sea Canal. It was a massive undertaking. The canal would stretch 141 miles from the White Sea in the northwest to the Baltic and serve as a valuable shipping route between the two seas. In 1933, construction began on another canal. The Moscow-Volga Canal would stretch for 80 miles, connecting the Moskva River with the Volga River. Stalin needed labor for both of these massive projects. Pressure by the United States and Europe, which were threatening to boycott buying timber from the USSR over concerns that it was produced with slave labor, which it was, led Stalin to clean up some of the logging camps and replace the slave laborers with paid ones. But he didn't just let the prisoners go, he sent them to build the canals. Most of the White Canal required digging through pure granite, and many at the time considered it a foolhardy endeavor. What's more, the Soviets would do it using only the most basic technology, basically throwing prisoners at it with no regard for their safety or humanity. Thousands of prisoners were sent to the Solovetsky Gulag, that first camp on the White Sea, and surrounding prisons on the White Sea Canal. The working conditions were horrible and dangerous. The lack of modern machinery meant the prisoners had to do everything by hand, even making their own tools. It was a chaotic mess. The canal ended up being dug to a depth of 12 feet, which was barely deep enough for the drafts of most ships at the time. Of the 170,000 prisoners forced to dig the White Sea Canal, over 25,000 died. Many were buried right there at the bottom of the canal before it was flooded. Yet more victims of Stalin's paranoia and lust for industrialization. If you were a brilliant scientist or engineer in Soviet Russia during the Stalinist regime, you still were not safe. Special research labs, called sharashkas, were set up inside the gulags for all the intellectuals and scientists that had been convicted of anti-Soviet sentiment. There, they worked on developing technology and solving engineering problems for the Soviet state, which would give credit for their discoveries to more upstanding Soviet scientists. Soviet aviation can largely be credited to many of these imprisoned scientists. Others were disease specialists who were forced to work on developing biological weapons for the Soviets. Some notable sharashkas inmates included the acclaimed writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn, whose novels helped bring to life the horrors of the gulags. Others included Sergei Korolev, a rocket engineer who later became the chief designer for the Soviet space program, and Yuri Kondratyuk, a pioneer in astronautics and inventor of the gravitational slingshot. Life for those in the sharashkas was relatively better than in the general population. They were still not fed much, but at least they didn't have to carry out the back-breaking physical labor that the other regular prisoners did. Lots of women in Stalinist Russia were arrested and sent to the gulags simply for being the daughters or wives of enemies of the state. Once in the gulags, they were forced into the same hard labor as men. Many traded physical favors with men for money or warmer clothing or food. Women were often assaulted by men who forced themselves upon them. Left with very few options, many women had to take on what they called a gulag husband for protection and survival. There were some incredibly strong women who survived these horrible experiences. One, named Alina Glinka, lived to tell a harrowing story of her journey to the Kolyma gulags. Glinka, an engineer, was 29 years old when she was arrested in 1950. She spent 6 years in the prison camp before being released a few years after Stalin's death. She was transported to the Gulag with a group of other women by ship. When they arrived in the small Siberian port of Bakhorchen, the women were taken to the town hall, where they were held before being transported to the Gulag in Magundin. In an essay, Glinka describes a horrific two-day series of unwelcome intercourse carried out by the guards on the women as they waited in the town hall. She writes it from an eerily detached perspective, perhaps the only way to distance herself from the trauma. The soldiers, whooping and hollering, rushed the women and began to haul them into the building. They nailed planks crosswise over the doors and began throwing women to the floor. A line of about a dozen men formed by each woman, and so began Kolyma Tram. Seeing as how the Soviet economy relied on the free slave labor of its gulags, you would think that the officers running the camps would want to keep a lot of them alive. Sadly, this was not the case, and there were often executions carried out both within the prisons and outside them, despite their prohibition by the higher-ups in the Stalinist regime. There were two sprees of executions that occurred in the Soviet prisons. The first came between 1937 and 1938 during what is known as the Great Terror. By this time, Stalin was in a state of complete paranoia. Afraid of losing power, he ordered the imprisonment and assassinations of a huge chunk of the Communist Party leadership and military apparatus. Carried out by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, the purge quickly escalated into a multiple executions event ordered by two of Stalin's generals, Genrikh Yagud and Nikolai Yusov. More than 680,000 men and women were decimated and dumped into mass graves on the outskirts of major cities across the country. Then, in 1941, the Nazis invaded the USSR, breaking an alliance between the two nations. 2 years earlier, the Soviets and the Nazis had invaded Western Ukraine, and Stalin began a campaign of conviction in the region, first locking up anyone who might be anti-Soviet. This included government officials and Ukrainian nationalists, then locking up just about anyone and their mother. As a result, the Soviet Union had prisoner camps throughout Eastern Europe. As Hitler's troops closed in, the Red Army retreated, and NKVD troops were told to evacuate the areas and move the political prisoners deeper within the Soviet Union. Instead, they executed them. In what became known as the NKVD prison executions, over 100,000 prisoners were executed in a few short weeks, many of them from Western Ukraine and Poland. The prisoners often were punished before the NKVD soldiers dispatched them. In the Lvov Oblast in Ukraine, there were stories of prisoners being crowded into cells, which would then be disintegrated. Within each gulag, there were punishment cells. These isolation chambers were reserved for anyone who refused to work, caught stealing, or committing any other type of crime within the prisons. In isolation, prisoners were often stripped of their clothes and given a meager ration of 200 grams of bread and 2 glasses of water per day. Some of the isolation cells were so small that prisoners could barely stand up inside them and had to sit with a bucket of their own feces for weeks on end. Other punishment cells were more like communal barracks, packed so full of people that they had to alternate between standing up and sitting down because there wasn't enough room for everyone to sit, let alone lie down. In the hills north of Magundin in eastern Siberia, there was an entire gulag that essentially functioned as one large punishment cell, Serpentika. So few prisoners survived the horrors of Serpentika that not much is known about what actually went on inside. The name alone was used as a threat to frighten prisoners in other gulags. Being sent there was the equivalent of a death sentence. One survivor recounted a story of how the guards would call out the names of prisoners stuffed into the barracks in the mornings, but nobody would answer. So the guards would haul out the people closest to the door, line them up outside, and give them capital punishment. The outbreak of World War II occurred during peak Gulag capacity. At its height, there were nearly 2 million people in the camps at any given time. During the war, a lot of them were sent to the front lines to fight. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, breaking the pact between Germany and the USSR, things got even worse for those in the gulags. Anyone with German or Finnish heritage was given extra loads of hard labor. Those whose prison sentences were due to finish were instead kept in the camps indefinitely. Refusing to work became not just illegal, but an act of treason. The prison mortality rate between 1942 and 1943 was the highest in the history of the gulags. More than 500,000 died in those 2 years alone of starvation, disease, and exhaustion, a number that's most certainly an underestimate. The Nazi invasion, nicknamed Operation Barbarossa, was shockingly effective. In just 1 month, they had taken Kiev and were besieging Leningrad. In 1942, Stalin issued Order 227, which became famous for its line, "Not a step back. Anyone caught in retreat was to be punished by death." But the order also created penal battalions, or strafbats. Thousands of Gulag prisoners were sent to the most dangerous parts of the front lines to atone for their crimes and bring honor back to themselves and their families. They were often either in the most direct line of fire or were sent out into minefields to clear them. Behind the penal battalions were blocking units, groups of soldiers who would fire upon anyone who retreated. Living in the Soviet Union outside of the gulags was no walk in the park either. By the end of the 1930s, so many adults had either died from war and famine or had simply disappeared that there were more than 7 million homeless children roaming the streets of the country. In 1935, Stalin passed Article 12 of the Penal Code, which allowed children as young as 12 to be arrested and sent to the gulags. With no other options, many of these homeless children were picked up for theft. Others were arrested simply because their parents had been too. For the Soviets, the apple didn't fall far from the tree. Life inside the gulags was bad enough if you were an adult. For a child, it was even worse. Children were often exploited for labor. What's more, Resolution 2213 stipulated that if children were less than 2 years old when their mothers were arrested, they would also be sent to the gulag and placed in camp nurseries. Lots of children were born inside the gulags too. Life in the camp nurseries was bleak. There was rampant neglect. Infant mortality was shockingly high. Those who survived often suffered extreme psychological trauma. Some reports tell of older children in the camps who couldn't even speak and only communicated with primal howls. When Stalin died in 1953, the Gulag system was slowly dismantled, a process known as the thaw. Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev, realized that the gulags were becoming unprofitable. By 1957, many of the largest camp complexes were closed. Slave labor was no longer the heartbeat of the Soviet economy. For many Gulag prisoners, freedom was something they were not ready for, and they would actually rather stay in the camps than face the outside world. One prisoner's diary entry reads, "I really don't want freedom. What has drawn me to freedom? It seems to me that out there are lies, hypocrisy, thoughtlessness. Out there, everything is fantastically unreal. And here, everything is real." Even those who were happy to leave the gulags were in for a tough time on the outside. Most gulags were located deep in Siberia, so the journey back was grueling. There was a bad transportation network, and many had to wait months for trains or else try to make the trek back on foot. Already weakened by years of hard physical labor and very little food, thousands more died after their release. The Gulag system was 30 years of paranoia and punishment for the people of Soviet Russia. Western nations turned a blind eye while it was happening, even supporting it by buying the stuff produced by the prisoners in the gulags. It turned Soviet Russia into a hollow shell. Its people were jaded. Its politicians valued industrialization over all else. It was an untenable situation that resulted in the collapse of the USSR less than 40 years after Stalin's death. What do you think? Could you survive life in the gulags? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more Nutty History.